Hey everybody, Chris here from Small Addictions RC, and today we're going to finish up our three-part video on assembling a complete MudBoss. Part 1 of the video series was wrapping the MudBoss body. Part 2 was actually assembling the MudBoss body into what you see here, and Part 3 is going to be putting the body onto the Slash. Now, if you need to refresh and go back to those videos, you can watch those, or if you're ready to go, you can just continue with this one. We're going to be using a completely box stock Slash. I'm going to give you a couple pointers and couple tips that you can follow, and we're just going to set it up for our local track here. Your setup might be a little bit different, but the idea is going to be the same. A couple things that we're going to need ahead of time: shock pliers, some fuel line tubing to put in the shocks for limiters, 2.5-inch body mounts. We're going to be using the stock chassis. We'll go over that in a little bit. Traxxas 2735 Stampede front bumper, just a hobby knife in case we need it, a 2.0 and a 2.5 Allen wrench, a pair of scissors, something to measure with. I'm going to use a caliper. Then we have some shock oil here and some shock stands and stuff, and just a couple tools that we might need. So I'm going to move this stuff out of the way for now until we need it, and we'll get our Slash ready. So basically, this is exactly how the Slash is going to come out of the box. Let's take this body off and we'll just kind of set it aside. One of the first things that we're going to do is we're going to pull the front bumper off and the front shock tower. Just get our tools here. Okay, now that we have the front bumper off, we're going to set it aside. Also set the hardware aside. A couple of these screws we're going to be reusing. Next, this front body mount right here, we're going to get that off. It's going to be a little bit more difficult. The screws are kind of angled down in the back, so the chassis is right in the way. There is some room here. You can just kind of bend it, get your driver in there the best you can. Okay, once you get your front body mount off, you can just set that aside temporarily. The next thing I want to do, this is more of a little trick. When you go to mount your body on, the servo is going to stick up quite a bit, and it's going to hit right here on your leading edge of the body. I've seen guys notch this out and do some crazy stuff in there, or they have their body jacked way up in the front, or it's bent. There's no need for that. It's a pretty simple solution. All you got to do is pop your servo saver off real quick. Just note the orientation. We're not going to move anything. Now, top side, we're going to take the 4 servo screws out that hold the servo in. Now you can see my servo is mounted from the top of the chassis down through. So we don't need to unhook anything. We're just going to take it, slip it in, just like that. We're going to take the same servo screws that we just took out of the top and mount the servo to the bottom of the chassis. Now, a lot of these tips that I'm showing you, these are all going to be for a a high center chassis, the stock chassis. If you're running an LCG chassis or building an LCG chassis based MudBoss, it's going to be a little bit different, but a lot of this stuff will still work the same. That servo is mounted completely different than this one, and you don't have an issue with any clearance as far as the body goes. Okay, we're going to mount our servo just how it was when we pulled it off. Put that screw right back in there. Okay, just like that. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start lowering the shocks. This is going to be, you know, your preference at your track of what you're going to do. I'll tell you the track that this truck will be running at. What we're going to do is we're going to set it up with 80 weight shock oil on the right hand side and 25 weight shock oil on the left hand side. That's going to be front and rear. We're going to put limiters in the front. The right front is going to be 15 millimeters. The left front is going to be a 16 millimeter. The right rear is going to be an 18 millimeter. And the left rear is going to be a 17.5 millimeter. Those numbers probably will be different at the track that you run at. I suggest talking to somebody. You can look online for some starting points. If you want to use this setup, go ahead and you can make adjustments from there. But what we'll do is we'll just pull one shock off so I can show you how to set these up. Okay. Now that we have our shock off, you probably will take all 4 of your shocks off at the same time, but I'm just going to do one with you so you can see how it's done. I have a little container here and a shock stand. Just going to pull the spring back so we can pull our bottom retainer off. Going to pull our spring off and our top retainer. So we're basically left with just the shock itself. Now the shock is going to be full of oil, so we're just going to open this up. I'm going to dump this shock oil right out. Now, I have a set of shock shaft pliers here. These are an aluminum plier that have a hard anodized coating on them, and they're not going to mar up my shock shaft. You can use a pair of needle nose pliers if you wrap them really good in a piece of cloth or something, but be very careful doing that. You don't want the serrated edges that are in those the pliers, because they're meant for a really grip. You don't want those marking up your shafts. If you mark up your shock shaft, every time that shock shaft goes up into your rubber O-rings, it's just going to tear them up. You're always going to have leaking shafts. So try to get yourself a decent set of pliers. You can get these right off of our website. These are going to make your life a lot easier, especially when you're rebuilding shocks. So you're just going to grip those right in there like that and spin this end right off. Okay, pull it out nice and gently. Now, here's our shaft with the piston on the top. This is riding in this shock body up and down. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a limiter underneath this. So if you can picture that, that limiter is going to keep this up, which is going to lower the car. Now I'm just using some Dubro, just a large standard fuel line tubing. You can use different things. A lot of guys use fuel line tubing. The fuel line tubing will break down after a while and probably split. This is something that you're going to be replacing every few weeks. You can also use like a hard shim if you want to put some hard limiters in there. They don't break down, but they're also very hard and rigid. I like the fuel line tubing because the fuel line tubing has a little bit of give. So if you have a track that's not perfectly smooth, or if it's got a little bump to it, the fuel line tubing does have a little bit of give in there, and it's more of a cushion than the hard rigid tube. This shock here, we need a 16 millimeter limiter. You want to try to get this as accurate as you can. Okay, so I'm happy with that. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this piece of tubing that we just cut and we're going to slip it right up in there. Might be easier, would take a little bit of that shock oil that we dumped out. It's going to help it slide up in there. Now you can see we have this piece of fuel line tubing underneath our piston. So as this piston travels up into the shock and comes down, it's going to stop right there, which will actually lower our vehicle. And that's what we're trying to do. We're getting the ride height down. I'm just going to take a little bit of shock oil, put it on the bottom of the threads, and just work it back in there. Be very careful. You don't want to rip the O-rings that are in the bottom of that shock. You can actually feel it as you're going through. And that's it, just like that. Now what I'm going to do is place this on my shock stand. I'm going to put oil in here till I can kind of just see it. You're probably not going to be able to see this, but I can see the oil. It's not quite to the top. Now what I want to do is I want to just work my piston up into that oil and bring it down. You're going to see all that oil is going to fall down to the bottom of this body. You want to get all that oil worked underneath that huge spacer that you just put in there. If not, you're going to have a bunch of air in your shocks, and your shocks are not going to work. Okay, so now I'm confident that I've got all the air worked out of it. What's going to happen is we're going to let this sit here. Now, if you're doing this at home, I recommend moving on to the next shock. Do exactly what we did to this point, then to the next one, until you have all four of them here. Now, by the time you do that, the first one, any air that's in there should work its way up. And then the second one, it's going to work its way up. So you want to get all of the air that's possibly in this oil. You want to let it work itself out. Now, once you get that far, you can go ahead, put your rubber diaphragm back on. With your shock cap. Now when you're doing this, just be careful. You want to make sure that that rubber diaphragm is sitting flush on there. You don't want it wadded up or half in, so then it's not going to work right. Just going to tighten this down. You can go ahead and run it up and down. That feels real good. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take our shock shaft pliers, spin the bottom back on. Just to reassemble the shocks the same way you took them apart. You're going to put your top spring retainer on, spring. I'm not going to cut my front springs down. The rules say, the Salvus rules say that you can cut them down. We're not going to cut these down. You can cut yours down if you want. This is where you would do it. These ones we're not going to cut down. Going to put that back on. and then my lower shock retainer. And there we have it, shortened shock. Now, at this point, we would put them all together, but I'm going to go ahead and do the other three, and then we'll put them all on at the same time. Okay, now that we have all 4 shocks done and installed, you can see that the chassis sits much lower now. So this is ready to carry on. Once you get to this point, next we're going to work on setting the front body posts. Now, the MudBoss body, just like a real Northeast Dirt Modified, is offset, so the body is also offset. With that said, you're not going to have any room on the right-hand side of the car for this rub rail. So we're going to pop this rub rail off. Okay, now that we have that rub rail off, we're going to move over to the other side. Now, these front Nerf bar mounting screws, this is where our new MudBoss body mounts are going to go. You can also use the stock front body mounts. You can take this front body mount and mount it here. The thing is, it sits about 1/4 of an inch too low. So a lot of guys will take and put a spacer to space this up, probably about 1/4 of an inch. We're not going to do that. That's not how I do it. For the $4, just get a set of 2.5 inch body posts. The left-hand side rub rail, we can leave that on because the body is offset to the left. So there's plenty of room for this to stay on. It gives you a little extra protection in case you get T-boned. These are Duratrax 2.5 inch body post, part number DTXC2616. This is what we would use on a high center chassis. If you were doing a low center chassis, the 4-inch body posts work. This is what we're going to use today. Now, the 2 screws that you took off your front bumper right here and here, you set those aside earlier. They're about 15 millimeters long. We're just going to use those to hold these body posts in. The screws that come with the body post and the original screws that were in that location are just going to be too short to use. So we're just going to reuse these ones off the front bumper. Okay, now that we have our front body post mounted, in that front body post mounting kit is going to be some collars. These collars are going to slip over the body posts. They're going to come with a little set screw. This little set screw is going to hold them in place so they're adjustable. That way there you can set where you want your body. Okay, now we have our front body post mounts in. I have the collar all the way at the bottom position, and then if we need to adjust it from there once we put the body on, we will. But for right now, we're just going to leave it like that. Next, we're going to do the front bumper. This is a Traxxas 2735. It's actually a Stampede front bumper. We're going to take this front bumper and you're going to notice we're going to mount it upside down. We're going to use the original, 2 of the original factory mounting screws from that front bumper. Just going to simply put it upside down, put it in the leading edge of the bulkhead. Now, the front of this body, where the nose piece is, it's going to ride perfect right with the edge of this front bumper. Everything's going to line right up. We have not cut any mounting holes out in this body yet, so I'm going to go ahead and just cut the back ones. I know exactly where they are. Now, just take our body, going to put it on the back first. What we want to do is we want to mark which holes that the front lines up with. So for the high center chassis, it's going to be the frontmost set of holes. The back set of holes is going to be for the LCG chassis. So we're not going to cut those ones. We'll just cut these front ones. Okay, now we're going to put this body on and see what kind of adjustments we need to make. The front shock towers are cut out, so you can just pop these through like that. Got our front body post through. We got our back body post through. Now, the front's a little high, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to lower those body mounts down. And we'll try it again. Now, the back looks pretty good from here. I'm going to put some body pins in to hold this body. Okay, so now we have our body on, and one thing I want to point out, if we can see, if you can get in there, the servo is just touching the upper part of our deck lid. So we didn't need to cut it or trim it or shave it or do anything. Since we dropped that servo down, we were able to get plenty of room in there to leave the deck lid as is. One more tip that I'm going to show you. We left the stock bumper on this one. A lot of guys will run the rear RPM bumper. I've got a car here that has the rear RPM bumper on it already. One thing I'll tell you about the rear RPM bumper is when you read the directions, it's going to tell you that the RPM logo is going to be on the upper part of the bumper. What we do is we actually flip the bumper over and mount it upside down. That way there it looks a little bit more scale and the bumper is not up into your header panel so you can read it. There you go. That's it, guys. That's a wrap on our Building a MudBoss video. If you guys have any questions on anything that we did, feel free to send us a message. Everything that we showed you today, all the tools, equipment, the wraps, the bodies, slashes, everything is available on our website at smalladdictionsrc.com. And remember, feed your addictions at Small Addictions RC.